Five Nights at Freddy's, made by Scott Cawthon, is a game that you've probably heard about, as it's one of the biggest horror games of all time, and in this video I'll be talking about the first 4 games in the franchise, which is what I would consider to be the golden age. And no, that is not a Berserk reference, it's just a coincidence. But before we actually begin talking about Five Nights at Freddy's, I'd quickly like to say that if you do enjoy this video going forward, then please make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment down below, and hit that big red subscribe button, because we are currently aiming for a total of 1,000 subs by the end of the year, and any help in that goal would be much appreciated. And hey, if you need more of an incentive to do all that, I have the nuclear launch code, so really you don't have a choice. But enough of my silly shenanigans for now, because I'd like to go ahead and give a brief introduction into what FNAF is, for anyone who doesn't already know. So here I go. Five Nights at Freddy's is an indie horror franchise that saw the release of its first ever game on the 8th of August 2014 by Scott Cawthon, who'd made a fair few games in the past. However, none of them really received too much attention, and the one that did, Chipper & Sons Lumber Co., was heavily criticised due to its unsettling nature and creepy characters that were described as being similar to Chuck E. Cheese animatronics. But this very criticism would actually turn out to be a good thing for Scott, because it led him to make Fnaf, a game about sentient animatronics at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, which of course gained massive amounts of success through people making gameplay videos and people doing theories on the mysterious lore of the game. Hell, it got so popular that they made a movie recently, although we'll talk about that later on in the series, because right now it's time to talk about the golden age, starting with the first ever FNAF game. So, Five Nights at Freddy's 1, the first ever game in the franchise, the game that birthed a massive horror franchise that's still going strong today, was an actually pretty simple game, because all you needed to do is keep the animatronics out of your office by using doors, lights, and security cameras, all whilst keeping an eye on your power. But even though it's simple, it's still scary. And for a good few reasons, but I'd like to start by talking about the animatronic designs, which are just so good, especially in comparison to some of the more recent mascot horror monsters we've had, because unlike a certain red fellow named Ban, the animatronics in FNAF aren't just designed with a bright colour palette in mind so that they can attract the attention of children. They are made to look scary. In fact, all of the animatronics in FNAF are designed with very dead and dirty colours, which allows them to blend in with the darkness of the pizzeria. And I like how all of them are basically just normal animatronics, yet they're made to look scary, not due to a change in design, but due to a change in setting. I mean, I can imagine the animatronics being children's entertainers, because during the day they probably look just fine, but in the game we see them in a completely different light, which makes them take on a whole other appearance. Their long stares and unsettling posture are so good at creeping me the hell out, especially when Bonnie is stood at the end of the corridor, only slightly concealed by the darkness, because it makes him look so damn ominous. But moving on, because I'd like to talk about the office now, as I think it's one of the biggest reasons this game is so scary. After all, you're in a small claustrophobic room with doors either side that you have to keep open, even though you know the animatronics are moving around out there, because if you don't keep the doors open, you'll end up draining all the power, which most of the time results in an automatic death, which I think is good because it forces you as the player to keep the door open, even though you know one of the animatronics could be lurking just outside. And I also want to point out just how incredible the sound design is, because I very rarely pick up on these sorts of things, but the sound design in FNAF is so good that I have to mention it, specifically the groaning noises that Chico will make from time to time, which are just so unsettling to listen to, and also a special mention to the fan, because he's been there since the beginning, constantly spinning around and making one of the most irritating noises in all of gaming history. What a hero. However, I am going to move on now, because I want to talk about the one thing that FNAF 1 did the best. Its lore. And I know that may sound a little stupid at first, because there is probably no other story out there quite as convoluted as FNAF. But back in the golden age, the FNAF lore was very simple. Like, there was no digital murder rabbits taking over VR games back then, and there was no Shamrock Freddy either. It was simply a mystery about a murderer who was taking the lives of children and then putting them them in animatronic suits that the children would then possess. It was grounded in reality but had a little bit of supernatural horror that didn't feel at all out of place, and the way you can learn about the lore is so good. After all, it was revealed by posters and newspaper clippings on the wall of the pizzeria, although when you start going down the route of characters being brought back from the dead over and over again, it kinda gets a little stupid, but hey, that's just about enough for Five Nights at Freddy's 1, because I still have 3 other games to talk about in this video. Although before I move on to FNAF 2, I'm gonna give the first one a rank, because I just thought it would be fun to rank all of them, and I'm gonna rank FNAF 1 at 3 on the list, because it did a ton of things really well, but I just prefer 2 other games way more than it. But that's enough of that, as it is now time for me to talk about the second FNAF. So, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was released on the 11th of November 2014, only 3 or so months after the release of the first game, and they're pretty similar when it comes to gameplay, as like the last one, you're still playing as a night guard at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria, although in this one you're working at a different place, which has plenty of new animatronics, but I want to focus on the new office at the moment, because I think it's probably the best feature in the entire second game, as the new office has one big entrance at the front of the room and 2 vents on either side of the room, which can't be closed, so there is nothing to stop the animatronics from getting into your office aside from a flashlight and a mask, which makes you far more vulnerable in FNAF 2, making the game much scarier because you no longer have the protection of the doors, which weren't even that great at protecting you in the first place, because they were like a leech to your powers, so most of the time they had to be open anyways. But the simple thought of being able to close the door is quite nice, as it gives you a sense of security, even if only for a short while. So when you have that little safety net taken away from you in FNAF 2, it's not really that fun, because now you're just left to face the darkness that's right in front of you, with only a flashlight that has limited power that can become even more limited due to that little prick balloon boy, and you're given a quirky little mask to trick some of the animatronics with that makes you sound like your average heart attack diner resident with the amount of heavy, uncomfortable breathing you do. So, all in all, great choice, Scott. I mean, I know it sounded like I was complaining, but in reality, taking away the doors for these new features was such a great idea and made the game way scarier as a result. But enough about that, as I haven't even really talked about the new animatronics yet, so let's go ahead and do that, because the animatronic designs in this game are so good, and probably the best in the franchise, because not only did we have the withered animatronics, which were basically just broken redesigns of the animatronics from the first game that I didn't really like too much. Something about the animatronics being all messed up like that kind of made them less scary to me. I mean, Withered Bonnie was great and his design was stunning, but the toy animatronics were just so much better, and almost definitely my second favourite from the entire franchise. And no, that's not because of Toy Chica. I'm not that much of a coon brain, okay? I'm not that damn bad. I just don't think any other animatronics in the franchise creep me out quite as much as the toy animatronics, and if I'm being honest, I really don't know why. It could possibly be due to how shiny they are, maybe my brain thinks they're uncanny or something, but really I just have no idea why they're so scary to me. However, I do want to go ahead and talk about the death minigames now, because I think they're really good at building on the lore of FNAF in a really interesting and creepy way that I don't think I've seen done before. Like, yeah, it's not too uncommon for games to show you a piece of lore after you've been killed, but to make you play an Atari-style minigame is not something I've seen done before, and the minigames themselves are actually pretty scary because they give you an idea of what happened at the pizzeria, whilst a distorted voice tells you to save them over and over again, which obviously you can't do. The minigames are tragic, they give us information on what happened, but they also manage to be scary at the same time, which is why I think that the FNAF 2 minigames are incredible, and overall, FNAF 2 was just great, and it makes sense why it's a lot of people's favourite FNAF game. However, I'm afraid I'll be putting it at 4th on the ranking, because I'm ranking them purely on how much I enjoyed them, so even though this one deserves to be at number 1, I'll be putting it in 4th place because despite how good it obviously is, there are FNAF games that I enjoyed much more. But with the ranking out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to the 3rd game. Five Nights at Freddy's 3 came out on the 2nd of March 2015, not too long after the second one, so around this time, Scott Cawthon was pumping out games like no tomorrow, although Fnaf 3 wasn't that great in comparison to the first two, but why? What was it that Fnaf 3 did so bad in my eyes? Well, first of all, the game only had one real antagonist. The other animatronics, the Phantoms, were just there to distract you temporarily, which kind of negates a bit of the fear factor, because when the threat of death is taken away, the animatronics kind of just become a nuisance, not to mention, they were just kind of forgettable, although the one that can actually get you is pretty great. The animatronic I'm referring to is Springtrap, and I really love this guy. I once made a rap about him, and my channel was once named after him, and I think he makes a fantastic antagonist. Because the character inside the suit, William Afton, or Purple Guy, has already been built up as some sort of awful monster that enjoys killing children by the death minigames in FNAF 2, so we already know this guy is messed up, but then if you put his already decaying self in a destroyed golden rabbit suit, you get a horrible amalgamation of metal and flesh that makes for a pretty damn horrifying design that weirdly makes a lot of people swoon, but I'm not going to comment on that and instead just move on, because I now want to talk about my main issue with the game, its setting, which is considerably worse than FNAF 1 and 2, because unlike the first two games, which are set in a pizzeria, this one isn't. Instead, it's set in a horror attraction based off of the tragedies that took place in Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. And yeah, that's not an awful idea, in fact it's far from it, but even so, I prefer the setting from the first two games, as the pizzeria isn't made to be scary, yet in the games it looks terrifying because the games are set at night, long after everyone has already left. Which means you're all alone in the dark labyrinth-like pizzeria that's had all of the joy and wonder sucked out of it by the arrival of nighttime, and mainly due to the setting of FNAF 3, I'll be ranking the game a lot lower than the first two. Even though I really like Springtrap as an antagonist, I'm still going to give Five Nights at Freddy's 3 a low ranking, which may seem a little harsh, but either way, I'm going to be putting Five Nights at Freddy's 3 at 7th on the ranking, because I personally just didn't enjoy it that much. However, with the awful ranking from me aside, it's time to talk about the final FNAF game in the Golden Age. Hi, editing me here. Just wanted to quickly say sorry because my dumbass actually forgot to talk about the Springlock scene, even though it's one of the most gruesome scenes in all of gaming history in my opinion, as we see William Afton get backed up by the ghost before being impaled from every direction by the Golden Bonnie suit. I just had to mention this because not doing so felt like a little bit of a crime considering just how good it was. However, the ranking will not be changing. Anyways, on to FNAF 4. Five Nights at Freddy's 4 was released on the 23rd of July 2015, so the games were still coming out pretty rapidly, but sadly I didn't like FNAF 4 too much either. I preferred it to FNAF 3, and I thought Scott made some pretty decent choices whilst creating the game. Like, making the player a child was a pretty good idea, because I think making the main character a child in any form of horror is always such a great choice, as children are so vulnerable to everything. In fact, one of the scariest things I've heard recently was a story called Pen Pal. It's a brilliantly written story about a man in his 20s who begins to put the pieces of his past together so that he can uncover the truth of his childhood. And in the third chapter of the story, Boxes, we're told about a time he went looking for his missing cat in his old house, which was currently abandoned. And I won't talk about what happens next, but I will say that this chapter wouldn't have been as scary if it was about adults, because unlike children, adults are actually capable of defending themselves against a real threat. However, children aren't, so making the player character a child is again such a good choice from Scott. And by the way, if you want to know more about Pen Pal, I recommend watching Creepcast by Wendigoon and Meat Canyon, because they did a wonderful 4-hour episode on it. But I'll stop glazing over Pen Pal now, because I'd actually like to talk about the new Nightmare animatronics, which are probably my least favourite animatronics in the entire franchise, because they just feel like they were trying too hard to the point where they're not even scary anymore, which is sad because I can tell there was obviously a good idea here, but it just fell flat. Although luckily Scott Cawthon fixed this problem with the release of Sister Location, but we'll talk about that in another video, because I quickly want to mention the setting for FNAF 4, because I actually think it's pretty decent. It feels nostalgic in a very unsettling way, but even now I hold the belief that the pizzeria setting is unbeatable. However, I'm gonna move along now as I want to talk about the mini-games from FNAF 4, because even though they weren't as good as the mini-games from FNAF 2, they need to be acknowledged because they birthed one of the best clips that's ever graced this earth. That, of course, being the clip of Markiplier saying,
"Was that the bite of 87?
And yeah, that might not make the game any scarier, but that clip touched my heart in a way that no other clip ever has. Even though it wasn't the bite of 87, I still love this clip so much. But now it's time for the ranking, and purely because of the Nightmare animatronics, I'm going to be placing this game at 6th. Because it did have some cool ideas, and honestly, I think it's a pretty good game, but as I'm sure you'll soon realize, my taste is so awful. So some of the games I'll be ranking above this really don't deserve to be there, but hey, that's just about enough of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, so why don't we just go ahead and conclude things. So that's the first 4 games in the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, and I call this the Golden Age, partly because of nostalgia, but also because they were just great games with a wonderful and mysterious story that had, and still has me gripped to this day. I think this era of FNAF was mostly perfect, and even though I haven't ranked some of them too high, that's just because I've got bad taste. In reality, every game I've talked about in this video is pretty damn good, so that's why I think these games can be considered the golden age of FNAF. But in the next part, I'll be talking about where the series should have ended, so again, make sure to subscribe and hit that bell, because that way you'll be notified when I release the next part. And also, please make sure to comment down below, because I love to hear all of your different opinions on every video I make. However, with that said, we have reached the end of the video, so goodbye until next time to all of you lovely, lovely people.